Hi there, this is Claus Holm, and I'm the writer of this book called Dreams and Awakenings, and I've published it last year, here in 2014. I'm publishing a new book in the spring of 2015, and that will be called Between Above and Below, and it'll be 4 long short stories. To do some advertising for that particular book, I will be shortly reading the first chapter of one of the stories in it. But for now, I'm going to read you a story from this book to see if you like my writing style and if you like the story style, the way it flows. And then you might enjoy my book and you can purchase it off of Amazon. But I will read you a story now called The Children's Street. Rob first saw the children on an afternoon in June when he was raking the mowed grass up from his lawn. He was in the front yard when he looked up and spotted the group of kids, 5 or 6 of them, moving down the street together. They walked slowly in a close group, with their shoulders almost touching each other. He didn't give them much thought. Children were not a part of his life, and he didn't care for other people's children either, but simply watched them pass by his house, their eyes casting glances at him, probably looking for empty houses they could break into or desecrate with graffiti, he thought. The children were all in varying ages, but mostly preteens, about 10 to 12, all boys. They were wearing shorts and t-shirts, none of them carrying bags or any other items. Most of them had their hands held in their sides, a few had their hands in their pockets. They were almost all blonde, varying shades of yellow, with a single brown head amongst them. They continued down the street and turned the corner, vanishing from sight. Rob continued his raking, smoking a cigar at the same time. His wife Dottie hated when he smoked in the house, so gardening was his only chance to enjoy his cigars if he didn't just want to stand in the backyard like a fool and smoke them. He picked up a shovel and put the cut off grass into the compost pile before putting out his cigar on the sole of his shoe. He went inside for a cup of coffee. The children were the furthest thing from his mind, except in a vague thought of having avoided the local youth criminals. The next time he thought of them was a few weeks later. Dottie had forced him to go to one of the street dinner parties, and had even made him wear a tie, and he hated every second of it. After the dinner, he and Ed Marshall from 2 doors down sat on the porch, listening to the women talking inside, while the 2 men were discussing politics for a while. Rob hated politics, and hated talking about it even more. So, you seem to have settled in pretty well, Ed said, as he leaned back in the porch chair. Yeah, we're getting there. They'd lived on the street for over 6 months now, but Ed seemed to think people took most of a generation to settle into a new community. In his eyes, you were never really a local unless you'd lived all your life there. That's good to hear. Ed chewed his cheek for a while and thought. It's a very nice neighborhood. It really is. Except those damn kids. Rob nodded, agreeing with him, but was a little puzzled. What kids? Haven't you seen them? Ed grunted. They walk up and down the street, staring at the houses. Oh, yeah. Rob remembered the kids he'd spotted on the street. I think I saw them the other day. Do they make a lot of trouble? More than you know, Ed said. Just be careful if you ever catch them looking at your house. That's all I'm saying. Rob nodded again. He once again thought of the kids, blank, vacant stares they'd watched his house with. Plotting, no doubt, as he thought when he saw them to do mischief. Have they been a problem long? Why doesn't someone talk to their parents? Ed gave a huffing sound in his throat. For longer than we'd like, that's for sure. He didn't seem keen to elaborate on the topic. Rob didn't follow it further, but instead asked about the game last night and whether Ed had seen it. This seemed to excite Ed more, and soon they were in a pleasant discussion about football. The children were not mentioned again. Dottie liked to go to the salon once a week, even if her hair was not in need of cutting or dyeing. Rob suspected it was simply a matter of catching up with the latest gossip with her friends. Usually this took place on a Friday afternoon, giving him a few hours of peace and quiet to read the paper, use the computer, or simply sit and watch the TV in some kind of peace, without listening to her incessant talking and asking who the murderer was in the movie that they were watching. As he sat in his TV chair, something made him turn his head. It felt like he was being watched. On the street outside, he could see two of the children standing on the sidewalk. They weren't talking or doing anything that seemed like they were causing trouble. In fact, they hardly moved at all. They looked almost relaxed, but they were staring right at him, through the window, their eyes both empty and focused, if that was even possible. He wondered if he should get up and tell them to clear out, but decided against it. He didn't think he was of any particular interest to them, but if he asked them to leave the sidewalk, they might decide he was the enemy and declare war on him with toilet paper and rotten tomatoes and eggs. He turned his head back to the TV, trying to concentrate on the afternoon movie. After a while, he decided to sneak a peek again, this time seeing three children standing there. They still simply appeared to stand, looking at his house intensely. It gave him a chill up his spine as he saw the blank emptiness in their gaze. He was fairly sure the first two of them had not even moved since the first time he saw them. Getting to his feet, he went to the front door and opened it. He didn't care about making an enemy of them now. He simply feeling that he needed to get them to stop looking at him. "Get off my lawn!" he yelled at the children, hearing his voice cracking a little. "Get away now! Move!" The three children, all boys he could see now, slowly turned and began walking away. One of them looked over his shoulder at Rob as they walked out of sight. Rob stood on the porch for a few minutes as if waiting for them to come back, but none of them did. Instead, Dottie came back, cheerful and full of stories. She'd had such a fright, she said, she'd almost been electrocuted when the new girl at the salon had hooked up the drying helmet wrong, and sparks had flown all over the salon. It had been terrible. Rob sighed. Dottie often had dramatic brushes with death that she would tell him about in excruciating details. He didn't know if she felt a thrill from telling him about them, but as she asked, he would tell her how much he detested it. To cut off the narrative, he asked her what was for dinner. She took the hint and disappeared into the kitchen. When Dottie one day came home and told him that she'd spoken with Mrs. Coulter down the block, he didn't really care. Dottie's stories didn't interest him a great deal. But something she said made him turn his head. "What'd you say, honey?" "I said Mrs. Coulter said how sad it was that this was a neighborhood without any children. She says it's all old retired folks like us, and how it needs some life from families with kids." "Well, as far as I've heard from Ed, the kids in this neighborhood are actually troublemakers." Rob shifted in his chair. "He said they made trouble for a long time, actually." "Oh, nonsense. Ed wouldn't know a child if it bit him in the nose. He's old and half senile anyway." Rob smiled, thinking how amusing it was to hear Dottie call someone else old. After her retirement, she still tried to keep well, her frequent trips to the salon helping out in that regard, but she still didn't look like she was 50 anymore. "Well, it's true. I've seen the kids, this group of young boys who stand around and watch people's houses. They look slightly spooky, to tell you the truth." Dottie put her teacup down. "There are no children on this street, Rob. Mrs. Coulter said so herself. The last family who lived here with children left about 2 years ago." Rob scratched his head. "Then I suppose those kids must come from some other street. I mean, they can't just come out of the ground." "Maybe, but I swear Mrs. Coulter seemed to think that there are no kids here, period. I haven't heard any kids playing outside either, and it's getting close to summer." Rob grunted and returned to the TV. He himself was glad there was no sound of kids outside at night, no soccer balls bouncing against his walls or windows. It made for much more peaceful days when he didn't have to fear for his flower beds. Dottie said something and he turned his head again. "What?" "I said, are you sure that it was kids you saw?" "Of course I'm sure. The other day some of them stood outside the house staring at me while I watched TV." He shook his head, annoyed. "It's hard to confuse kids with something else, don't you think? Well, like I said, they must come from another street. That's the only thing I can think of. Rob settled back in his chair in his most comfortable position. Dottie kept talking, but he didn't listen anymore. It was always more of the same anyway. At the end of the month, Rob visited his tobacconist in the downtown area. The cigars he preferred was not sold in their local market, so he had to go far to get them. He didn't mind. It was a chance to drive the car and see something else than the street. He parked the car in the small parking lot and went inside, enjoying the smell of freshly cut tobacco. "Hi, Howard," he greeted the clerk. "That time of the month again." "Hey, Mr. Nelson, good to see you." Howard was a younger man, freckled and with a huge grin. "You too." Rob walked to the counter, picking up a pack of cigars from the rack. "I'll take a couple of packs this time. Pension check just came in, and I'm feeling good." Howard put the cigars in a plastic bag. "So, any news from the Children's Street, huh?" "What do you call it that? Because of the lack of kids?" "Well, no. Because of the children that supposedly haunts it all the time. Haven't anyone told you about that old story yet?" Howard blinked, as if this was common knowledge. "There's supposed to be a group of kids walking the street, some boys who were killed back in the 1930s or something. A drive-by shooting that went wrong, after what I've heard. So now they haunt the street or something." Rob's fingers froze as he was digging out bills from his wallet. "Haunting? You mean like ghosts?" "Yeah, well, it's just an urban legend, Mr. Nelson. Nothing to worry about. They say that if someone on the street's going to die, the kids stand outside the house and wait for him or her. It's all these campfire tales, but most of the old folks still call it the Children's Street. I honestly thought you knew about that." Rob leaned forward over the counter and stared at Howard. "Howard, please, I need you to tell me everything you know about that story." "But I just did. It's all I know. Are you okay? You look terrible." Rob felt dizzy. He grabbed his cigars, threw down a bill without looking at it, and fled from the store. He didn't stop until he was behind the wheel of his car, leaning on it, feeling his heart pounding far too fast in his chest. It had to be a coincidence. He'd seen boys outside, and they hadn't looked like ghosts. They'd looked like regular boys, maybe a bit intense, but still regular and normal children. Of course, another option could be that the boys were exactly what he'd said to Dottie. Kids from another street, now maybe making pranks by dressing up and pretending to be ghosts. The equivalent of putting on a sheet and tapping the windows at night for your neighbors. Still, he felt his body shivering as he thought back to the sight he'd seen outside his house. The empty stares from the eyes under the short hair. Had they been cut in the style of the 30s? He didn't remember. Short haircuts had not changed enough for him to really tell. He started the car up and pulled out, feeling the need to get home. There was no sign of the children when he came home, and he breathed a sigh of relief. Now back in his own house, he felt better about the whole thing. Of course, it was just a story. He was just a silly old man who'd gotten a bee in his bonnet about something you could scare your scout troop with around the campfire in the summer while roasting your marshmallows. Dottie came up from the basement where she'd been doing laundry. She looked at him, cocking her head slightly. "Are you all right, Rob? You look like you've been sweating." She came a few steps closer. "Have you been running? You know what the doctor said about that." "Oh, leave me alone," Rob said, gesturing with his hand to dismiss her. "I'm not a fossil yet. I just walked briskly to the car, that's all." All right, all right. I'm just trying to look out for you, you silly old goat." Dottie kissed him on the cheek and rubbed his arm. "Why don't you sit down and take a load off then? I'll bring you your root beer and a cookie." Rob mumbled something, but sat down in his chair. He sometimes felt like Dottie was treating him like he was made of glass. "You have one heart attack," he thought, "and the whole world thinks you're a princess on the goddamn pea." He drank the root beer when she brought it to him. It was nice and cold. He even remembered to thank her before he turned the TV on and began watching a game show. He was working in the garden again a few days later when Dottie came out of the house. "I'll be at Marjorie's for an hour and a half, dear." She looked positively glowing. "Some fresh gossip to share?" he said, pulling out a weed and throwing it over his shoulder. Oh, Poppycock, I'm playing dominoes with her and Lindsay and Janice. We do have other interests. Oh, I'm sure you do. And in between your turns, I wonder what the topic of conversation will be. What kids or grandkids got married, had kids, went into college, or had some kind of scandal. Those things are important news. Dottie smiled at him. Janice's godson just got into the law school, for instance. Good for him. Another unemployed lawyer in the making. She slapped him lightly on the back. You're such an insufferable grump sometimes, Rob. You should come along. We could use another player. Linda has trouble seeing the pieces sometimes. Playing dominoes with four old hens like you? No thanks. I think I'll stay here and finish this. At least that's useful. Dottie bent, not without pain from her hip, and kissed his head. Be good. I'll be home in time for dinner. The pork chops are defrosting in the fridge. She walked off, her purse swinging back and forth from the crook of her arm. Rob returned to his weeds, but about an hour later decided it was time for a break. He sat up and reached for his cigar case, pulling one out with his matches. When he lit the match, he let his eyes glide over the street, and there were the boys. They were still a few houses away, but walking slowly towards his house. They were walking in a close group, just like the first time he'd seen them. Their steps seemed coordinated, not exactly a march, but in a rhythm that made sure none of them stepped on each other's feet. Rob lit the cigar and sucked the air into his lungs. He picked up the small planting shovel he used to dig in the flower bed, holding it like a weapon. He had no idea what he would do or use it for. If they were ghosts, a shovel wouldn't do him much good, and were they real children, striking one of them with a shovel might land him in jail. Still, it felt better to hold something in his hand. The boys came closer, finally reaching the sidewalk outside his house. Here they stopped, and in one slow, synchronized movement, turned their heads and bodies towards his house. Their eyes seemed to hit him with the force of laser beams, an icy stare from 6 pairs of eyes that sent chills down his spine. Go away, Rob said. He took a cigar out of his mouth with his free hand and took a step forward, even though the chill from the boys was now almost a physical thing. I don't know what you are, ghosts or not, but you aren't got no business here. This is my house. The brown-haired boy took a step forward and spoke up, his voice infinitely older than his face. We're not here for you. Rob caught himself exhaling in relief a moment before he heard an echo of Howard's voice. They said that if someone on the street is going to die, the kids stand outside the house and wait for him or her. 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 You're here for Dottie, Rob said, not asking a question. The boy didn't answer. He simply kept looking at Rob and at the house. The other boys stood like statues behind him, also simply looking. Doing the job they'd been doing for so long. Rob now understood. Please, he said, feeling terrified in a very different way than he had felt a moment ago. Please, don't take Dottie. Please. She hasn't done anything. She'll come home from her friend in a little while, and she will hurry. She'll be late, and she will cross the street just over there to get home fast, to make your dinner. The boy lifted his hand and pointed. She will feel a short dizziness and fall down. It will not hurt. She will be gone before she knows it. Please. Dottie hasn't smoked in her whole life. She's living healthy. She has her time. As do you. Rob threw away his cigar. Then switch them. You can do that, can't you? Just leave her and take me instead. I'm the one that smokes and drinks. I'm the one who deserves to go first. The boy was silent for a moment. Rob felt as if the whole world around them had gone silent, the street seeming to be empty of people except for them. You would do this? He finally asked. Why? Because she's done everything for me. Rob cleared his throat. I can't let her do this too. The boys looked at each other for a moment before the brown-haired boy nodded. Dottie came back about 40 minutes later. She knew she should have left the game earlier, but the story of Marjorie's son and California surfer had been too good to miss. Rob was probably going to be all in a huff if his food was not ready in time, but she was sure he would get over it. Still, she hurried. As she stepped into the street, she looked at her purse for a Kleenex, almost missing the van that crossed in front of her. Had she taken a step forward a second sooner, it might have hit her, but as it was, it passed by her in about one step's distance. As she came to the other side, she saw a few people standing on her lawn. Ed, Charlie from the other corner house, and Brad from across the street. When they spotted her, Brad walked towards her. His face was serious, and she immediately sensed something was wrong. Dottie, Brad began, holding his hands up. You shouldn't. It's Rob. He's had an accident. Nonsense. Is he all right? She asked, trying to push past him. Brad held her shoulders and looked at her straight in the eyes. No, Dottie. Rob's dead. It looked like it was a heart attack or something. He just keeled over. Ed said she saw him from his porch. He just stood there and smoked and fell down. Dottie pushed her way past Brad and walked fast to the body lying on the grass. Rob was on his back, lying almost peacefully on the lawn. He looked straight up into the summer sky, his cigar lying next to him. Dottie knelt and put a hand over her face. Oh, you grump, she said, her eyes filling with tears. Then she noticed that Rob's face was in fact not grumpy. His grimace of surliness, almost ingrained in his features, was replaced with a smile and a look of contentment. It was, she thought, the look of a man who has after a long time found the purpose he had been looking for. So that was my story from this book, from Dreams and Awakenings. And as I said, you can look it up on Amazon.com or .co.uk. It's available both in electronic form and as a paper book. And Between Above and Below will be out here in the first couple of months of 2015. I hope you like it, and I hope you buy it. That's all for now. Bye.